In my previous video, I talked about mediocrity as a byproduct of postmodernism and used gender studies, its anti-intellectual rhetoric and flimsy arguments such as patriarchy theory to illustrate that point. Another noticeable aspect of postmodernist ideas and social justice causes generally is that they operate more like a religion than an academic discipline. This recent article in Quillette makes that same point about intersectionality, one of the cornerstones of the identity politics movement. The article was written after the author witnessed a panel discussion at Rutgers University in early October. The panel was sponsored by Spiked magazine and was titled Identity Politics, the New Racialism on Campus, and asked the question, does identity politics cut us off from important conversations on issues that affect us all? Well, you can put me down for a resounding yes to that question. Now, the panel included Camille Foster, a black libertarian and host of the Fifth Column podcast, Brian Statscavage, a writer and student at the very progressive Wesleyan College, whose op-ed, mildly critical of Black Lives Matter, was subsequently defunded by the Student Union, Sarah Hayter, co-founder of Ex-Muslims of North America, and Mark Leela, a progressive critical of identity politics. So hardly a group of right-wingers. During the opening statements of each of the panelists, the audience listened attentively. Then, when it was opened up for questions and the panelists responded, the social justice crowd started interrupting, talking over the top of speakers with mostly incoherent diatribes and even at one point chanting Black Lives Matter. Here's one such incident.
The notion that, for example, hate speech is not free speech is wrong. Hate speech is, in fact, protected speech. In fact, hate speech, legally speaking, is not a thing in the United States of America. It is not a category of thing. It is, in fact, incredibly difficult to get people to agree on what hate speech is. And I think this is an important distinction to make because for so many years in this country, and I'm pointing to the 1960s in particular, speech protections were used by minority groups who were fighting for civil rights, and it was essential for them to be able to secure those rights in order to advocate. The reason why Martin Luther King, for example, wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, is because he was imprisoned for effectively violating speech codes, handing out flyers in the wrong spot, all of these various things. I think this is something that we don't necessarily understand.
Black Lives Matter.
This is interesting. Let's give them a second. Has anyone disagreed with that? Has anyone disagreed with that principle? Have you ever gone someplace and had someone scream Black Lives Matter and had someone respond that that's not true?
Yes, quite a few times. Yeah.
They've said that's not true? Well, guess what? None of those. Okay, well, hold on a second. No. No one. Check this out. Check this out. Can I finish?
Yeah, like for real.
I
am with everyone trying to respect freedom of speech. There are some people here. This is an opportunity for us to really educate ourselves on what's going on in reality. And I'm going to let the panelists speak, but after the panelists speak, there is something that I need to say, because when we talk about identity, we need to understand that this country was formed off of creating whiteness and separating blackness. So we can't separate. No. We cannot separate our identity.
This isn't the.
This is what's going to happen. Camille's going to finish his point. We're going to go down the panel. Then we're coming back out. We're going to come back to the point.
History. I look at the news to say black people are dying. I don't need statistics.
Do facts matter?
Sir,
do facts matter? Do facts matter?
Let me tell you something about it.
All right, hey, this is how this works. If people shout, no one.
So we'll continue.
Control the facts. It's the system. It's the institution. Don't tell me about facts. I don't need no facts.
Okay.
Tell me that I am in a state of oppression because of the state. And I don't need no Republican or no Democrat to help me for my freedom. Because imagine with Hillary Clinton in the office, massive amounts of incarceration will happen. It is capitalism. Why our people
that's a whole nother topic. So how about this at this point? We let Camille finish his point, we go down the panel, and then we come back out. The more you shout, the less everyone in this room has an opportunity to make their points and to listen to everyone else. I'm sure you do. I'd like what he was saying if he put his hand up.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
It's colonialism. It is the fact that you have one group of people control over another group of people. That's what it was.
Yeah, and I think that answers the question of whether identity politics cuts us off from important conversations. Anyway, I'll link to the full video below, but I want to concentrate on the article because I think it gives a great description of how hollow intersectionality and thus identity politics is. The following is about halfway through the article. One of the things that struck me over and over was the protesters' complete intolerance of complexity. Despite intersectionality's roots in academic theory, the politics of the intersectional left are deeply anti-intellectual. It's not just that many intersectional activists seem to have no capacity for nuance, they fear and hate it because they hate anything with the potential to complicate their narrative. Things are right or wrong, you're with us or against us. Human beings, rather than complex agents with independent motivations and intellects, are nothing more than the sum total of their identities. Get on the bus or get under it. And that's the same with feminism. There is no nuance. Everything can be blamed on the patriarchy. Why don't more women do computer science? It's gender stereotypes, thanks to the patriarchy. Except, of course, in Saudi Arabia, where 45% of computer science graduates are women, because we all know how progressive Saudi Arabia is, compared to, say, Switzerland, where the number is less than 10%. But back to the article. I'm not the first to notice that intersectionality has less in common with an academic school or political movement than a religion. It is a fundamentalist religion with no tolerance for ambiguity, and like any newly founded religion, it is insecure. People who disagree are blasphemers. People who change their minds are heretics, and the true believer cannot ever rest knowing that out there, somewhere, anywhere, are people who think differently. They must be converted or destroyed. And like a religion, intersectionality has its rituals and catechisms. As linguist John McWhorter put it in an incisive essay for the Daily Beast, the call for people to soberly acknowledge their white privilege as a self-standing totemic act is based on the same justification as acknowledging one's fundamental sinfulness as a Christian. One is born marked by original sin. To be white is to be born with the stain of unearned privilege. Not by coincidence did a post-war generation of ex-communists searching for a way to describe their catastrophic disillusionment call communism the god that failed. For many left activists, intersectionality functions like the Marxist dialectic did for earlier radicals, not only as political prescription, but as all-encompassing, all-explaining theory. Like Marxism in its more vulgar forms, intersectionality is highly deterministic, with no allowance for individual human agency, and, like Marxism, intersectionality takes a rather cynical view of society, which it believes is simply a giant web of power relations. Like most theories that claim to explain everything, intersectionality quickly turns out to explain almost nothing. The presumption that a person's politics and worldview are determined by their race or gender or sexuality is both insulting and easily shown to be untrue, which is why leftist activists tend to react with confusion or hostility when they meet a black libertarian or a gay conservative, or anyone who doesn't think of their racial or sexual affiliations as the defining aspect of their humanity. Now, at this point, the author refers to a young man in the audience that makes a short statement about identity politics.
Looking at the world and all social phenomena strictly through a racial prism, I think engenders a certain type of myopia. I'm a Puerto Rican guy from the Bronx raised in a single-parent household, and it's like, but what does that mean? Should I think a certain way because of that? I don't. And, you know, people like diversity as a thing. Diversity is a thing that we all speak of. It's a value. How many people care about idea diversity? I'm wondering how many protesters here have read Thomas Sowell or John McWhorter or Jason Riley, but read it openly, you know, to receive it. So it's just something I wonder about, like, why would you want to build an ideological prison around yourself? And I've heard people say that, you know, they can't disconnect from identity. I fear they wouldn't have it any other way.
Thank you very much. Right,
and that really nails it. The difference between somebody who can embrace complexity, think for themselves, and not mindlessly follow a group identity. A brown man from a single-parent home and low socioeconomic background. According to leftist ideology, he should be a perfect candidate for the Oppression Olympics, but he refuses to play that game. If every messy and intractable problem in society can be blamed on abstract single causal phenomena, white supremacy, structural oppression, patriarchal heterosexism, there's no motivation to master the technical complexity of public policy, or build electorally viable political platforms, or to entertain alternative theories of and potential solutions to inequality, still less to engage with those who disagree. Why bother when the problem is simply that people need to change? One can invent a narrative that makes the people who disagree with you the most despicable human beings on earth, Foster said at one point. That doesn't make that narrative true. The whole teetering husk of what we used to call democratic civil society is built on the crucial premise that one can coexist with others with whom one disagrees, even people whose views one finds repugnant. But the protesters at Rutgers, like those at William and Mary and Reed and campuses across the country, made it clear that they can't. They view free speech and rights in general as a one-way street. They are entitled to voice their opinions at any and every moment, but people who hold what they've decided are the wrong views are entitled to no opinion at all, ever. A number of people on the left no longer seem to understand that rights like free speech are universal and reciprocal for a reason. Rights exist for them too, and the day may come when they're the ones with their backs against a wall. But by then, the liberal principles they hold in such contempt may no longer exist to protect them. Theirs is a reckless revolutionary logic of ends justifying means. It's a posture that is not only morally troubling, but also, as Mark Liller pointed out, pathetically inadequate to the task of achieving power and governing in one of the world's largest, messiest, and most diverse republics. After yet another audience disruption, he gave the evening's most acid rejoinder. I'm old enough to remember the politics of the late 60s and early 70s, and I can tell you how this movie ends. It ends with you accomplishing nothing. So, are the intersectionalist identitarians doomed to failure? I hope so, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.